Hey everyone, I'm Brian Miller, one of your Associate System Medical Directors. I want to welcome you to the Tube Talk video module. In Dr. Jarvis's delayed sequence intubation, PRM, he discussed all the components surrounding intubation safety and to ensure our first pass success without hypoxia and hypotension. While all these steps of pre-oxygenation, positioning, monitoring, hemodynamic optimization, and the administration of ketamine and a paralytic are there to ensure optimal intubating conditions, we all know that where the rubber really meets the road is when that blade enters the mouth. So we have to have excellent intubation technique to ensure our first pass success. Furthermore, as Dr. Jarvis discusses in his Science Behind DSI videos, each successive intubation attempt we make is associated with a higher risk of complications. Therefore, we must ensure the highest first pass success possible. I also want to leave cardiac arrest out of this as well. While we are evolving our cardiac arrest care to make intubation second line and only after a supraglottic has been initially unsuccessful or fails later, we still must be proficient at cardiac arrest intubations. Each successive intubation attempt in cardiac arrest is associated with a decreased favorable neurological outcome. I also want to take a moment to reframe our mindset. Many of us think of intubation as just one big step: blade in the mouth, tube through the cords. But in reality, this is a very highly complex psychomotor skill that we're doing. There are many micro skills or tiny little steps that if we do with technical precision, those add up to that successful intubation. So we need to be successful at each of those little micro steps along the way to be overall successful with our intubation. So what are we going to do in this video? Well, we're going to cover tips, tricks, pearls, and best practices to ensure that you are successful on your next intubation. These are going to mostly center around the 5 tips for intubation success. Those were developed after watching hundreds of videos and distilling the intubation process down into the key components that will make you successful. As you're aware, our quality improvement process for airway management includes the capture of video recordings from the UE scope. Those are then collected and then reviewed. I firmly believe that these videos are some of the greatest teaching tools for intubation technique possible. So we're going to review some really good videos and then some, ones that made significant improvements. So with that background, let's jump right into our first video.
What we have here first is an example of a nice clean and quick intubation with really good technique overall. What you're going to hear me do is give you essentially a play-by-play while we're watching the videos, highlighting good technique as well as some points for improvement. So let's start this first video now. So you see we're at the tip of the tongue here. We're working our way down the tongue in a progressive fashion. You see the suction is already in place, leading ahead of the blade to clear any of those nasty secretions that you now see in the back of the throat there. This looks like maybe a cardiac arrest airway. So we put our blade into the vallecula. You now clear a little bit more with suction, and then you see the suction come off to that left side in the salad position. And we are overall holding a 50-50 view. It looks like it's generally in the middle of our screen in a midline fashion, and you're gonna see the bougie come in now here, and the bougie comes in and it easily passes behind the cords, and this is followed right up with the tube quickly after, and overall this intubation is around 47 seconds and successful. So as we said, we're going to learn from the really good airways as well as some of the bad ones as well. And this is a particularly ugly example where we have lots of room for improvement. So as we go into this one now, we see the blade is immediately placed too deep and it's past the tongue. We haven't located the epiglottis yet, and all we're staring at is a ton of secretions there. All these secretions are just hanging out there to contaminate our blade's lens and end our day on this intubation attempt. No suction is in sight to this point. We haven't used it to lead our blade at all. So the secretions are just sitting there sloshing back and forth. Finally, a little bit of suction here. And then since we didn't work our way down, we ended up with a blade that is way too deep. We see 100% of the cords here. We see no epiglottis, and this is a too deep view and why the bougie is not passing well. Here we're going to slowly correct that view and get the blade into the vallecula. However, now we have another issue. We've now moved way far to the right. You see the entire right-sided wall of the back of the throat there, and the glottis is off the midline. And this is exactly why the bougie is still having trouble passing, is now we are off the midline. So the secretions are all still hanging out there waiting to contaminate our lens as well. And so they pass the bougie, but then I'm gonna take you off camera for a second. So what you're gonna see now is the blade being reinserted. And that's because we pulled the blade out immediately after we passed the bougie and did not visualize the tube being placed. And so we had difficulty as the tube was catching all the soft tissues there, and now we're going in to figure out what's going on. So here you see actually the balloon never actually even made it past the tongue here. And so we're trying to work our bulb in, and so we're hanging out in the corner of the mouth. We aren't actually seeing this tube actually pass cords to this point, and this is just burning time up as we're unable to ventilate still. Here we come back in again, and this is what's going to show you the major danger out of all of this is when you don't visualize your tube going through cords, your bougie can actually pop out of the cords, and what you're going to see is actually a tube that was in the esophagus. So it looks like you might have been actually past cords there, but bang, that is totally outside the cords, and this was an esophageal intubation. Now that we've had a chance to see the overall flow of things as well as a good and a bad video, I want to move right into the meat of this presentation, which centers around the 5 tips to increase your next intubation's first pass success. I truly believe if you can employ all 5 of these tips on each and every one of your airways, you will be successful on the vast majority of those airways. So our first tip is to maintain a 50-50 view every single time you intubate. Your view and your blade's positioning are the single greatest predictors of whether you will be successful or unsuccessful in that airway. Using a 50-50 view sets you up for the greatest success. As a reminder, this is what your 50-50 view looks like. As you can see, the glottis is in the top 50% of your screen there, and you also see only about 50% of the cords, hence that 50-50 view. You see the glottis is not consuming the entire screen. You can also see a rim of the epiglottis there. We haven't overrun the epiglottis and plunged it into the cords itself. And you also see the blade is well positioned in the vallecula. Using this view, you're using the blade curve to your advantage, and the bougie should pass easily. If you go too deep, you're using the blade's curve actually against yourself, and the bougie is going to continuously go posteriorly. So let's get into some videos for examples of this. This next video is an example of the challenges and difficulties that happen when we go too deep and don't establish a 50-50 view. So here we are, we see suction come in, that's great initially, but we don't walk down the tongue and immediately end up way too deep. And what you see is a 100% view of the cords there. You don't see any epiglottis. We're not in the vallecula. You can actually see the esophagus down there, and there comes in the bougie. It's immediately going to posterior. And you can also see a thing called the Kovac sign. The Kovac sign is basically where you can see tracheal rings, and you can see straight down the trachea, which is another bad sign that you're too deep. You also see a little bit of fogging on the screen there for a second. That means we're way too up close and personal with those cords. The bougie has tried to be passed. We almost get it. However, since we're so deep, it gets hung on the anterior tracheal wall there. And so at this point, I'm going to pause the video to save us some time. And so as we fast forward ahead here, this is now still us working on the same airway on the same attempt. We're now 60 seconds ahead after we've fought with the bougie for a full minute. And now we've gotten frustrated. We're using the tube to see if that'll pass. The tube is ultimately unsuccessful as well because we still are just too deep and the blade angle is working against us due to us not getting a 50-50 view. So in summary, this was a relatively easy airway that we made way more difficult by going too deep and spent a total of 2 minutes on this attempt only to ultimately be unsuccessful. So here's an example of a nice clean 50-50 view and successful intubation. As you can see, we're walking down the tongue, progressively looking for that epiglottis. We locate that epiglottis. We take that blade, we put that blade into the vallecula and establish a 50-50 view. You see suction coming in a little bit late, probably should have done that a little bit earlier, and then the suction is placed in a salad positioning. You see a rim of the epiglottis, you see about 50% of the cords, and it's at the top 50% of your screen. The bougie is coming in now. The bougie goes past cords, a little bit of a right turn here, and the bougie passes through. Waiting on the tube here now, and the tube comes right in. It passes nicely because we're not too deep, and this is about a 38-second intubation in total. Let's move on to our second tip now. I want you to deliberately curve your bougie during your intubation prep. As you recall, the UE scope uses a hyperangulated blade, or has about a 45-degree angle at the tip. If you don't curve your bougie to match that, the bougie will just impact the back of the throat oftentimes because it's not matching that angle. If you deliberately increase your bougie curve, you can easily follow the blade's curve and get the bougie in easier. So remember, when you bring your bougie initially out of the bag, it's often in a U shape and straight at both ends. What I want you to do is I want you to grab the coude tip and I want you to wrap it around your hand just like this. So grab the coude tip and wrap it around your hand. That is giving you the last 10 centimeters or so of that bougie with a nice little curve like this. So now when you compare your bougie and your blade, you see your bougie has the same angle as your blade. This will prevent your bougie from darting posteriorly or below the cords when you're trying to pass it. Also, this may give you a little bit more leeway if you don't have the most optimized 50-50 view. We rarely see the bougie on video prior to being inserted into the mouth. However, on this video, we caught a glimpse prior to intubation, and as you can see, it's in a D-loop conformation and very, very straight all the way to the tip. I would recommend not using the D-loop anymore. It was great for direct laryngoscopy with a standard geometry blade. However, the UE scope is not a standard geometry blade as we talked about and has a 45-degree angle at the tip. So let's use a solo bougie with a deliberately increased curve. So let's see how this works out with a D-loop. Here we are walking down the tongue a little bit. All right, some secretions there that we probably need. I don't see suction anywhere yet. And we basically get into the vallecula. We have a pretty good view. You can see the rim of the epiglottis here. We're a little deep. This is a little beyond a 50% of the screen view. We see about 50% of the cords though. We're a little off the midline, a little bit to the left, but you see the bougie is just going posterior and posterior and posterior. So this is a little frustrating here. And so they're basically trying to eke that bougie up and overcome that super straight line and get it to curve upwards, which is difficult using the D-loop in straight conformations. Here the tube gets a little bit hung up. We're gonna watch this for a second. We're gonna talk about some tips how to avoid that later on. But ultimately this tube is going to pass in a second here, and it is a successful intubation, but about a minute in length, which could have been much shorter given the bougie curve and some other troubleshootings as well. All right, tip 3. I want you to stay midline from the insertion of the blade all the way down until you place the blade into the vallecula. Trap the tip of the tongue with the tip of your blade, walk down the tongue midline, and then ultimately put the blade into the vallecula in a midline fashion. This will keep you from getting lost in the tongue itself, the soft tissues of the back of the throat, or end up entering the vallecula at a weird angle and make your bougie passage more difficult. So here's a view of us being too far to the right and a little bit short. You see the vallecula right here, that's our target. That's where we want to put our blade into, is that hyoepiglottic ligament right there, which serves as a trapdoor effect on that epiglottis. But what we see is we're short and we're also too far to the right. You can see that whole right side of the airway in view. This is one where we're too far to the left and too short. Again, you see the hyoepiglottic ligament, or the vallecula area right there is where we want to put our blade into. But this time we're coming at it from an angle because we're way too far off to the left, and we can see the whole left side of the wall of the back of the throat. Here's an example of what happens when we don't stay midline from insertion to the vallecula. So here we are walking down the tongue initially, but then we do basically a tongue sweep to the left. That's an old school direct laryngoscopy habit that we need to break. By tongue sweeping off to the right, we often end up on the right side just like this. And now we're kind of lost in the soft tissues. Tons of secretions as well. We definitely needed suction and narrowly avoid contaminating our lens right there. And so finally we find the epiglottis, get into the vallecula, but what you see is the glottis is far off to the left, and you see a ton of right-sided structures here. You're going to see the bougie come in a second here, and the bougie is going to have difficulty because now our angles are off. The bougie is coming in cross-angled, and our X and Y axis, or up, down, left, right, is off from what it appears in the screen. And so we think we get the bougie in right there, but due to this problem, we actually lose the bougie out of the glottis. And I'm going to pause here for a second. And now we've advanced about 40 seconds. We're still having bougie issues, and due to not being midline, we are ultimately unsuccessful with this intubation. Now for tip 4. I want you to suction prior to and during blade insertion every single time. If you encounter significant secretions pooling or continuing to build up in the back of the throat, I want you to use the salad technique and park that suction on the left side during your intubation to protect your lens while you're placing the bougie in your tube. A great analogy is a blind person with their white cane. They use the white cane to find their way. It clears any obstacles and helps lead them along, and the blind person follows behind the cane. Just like that, your suction leads your blade. It clears those obstacles, particularly secretions, to prevent them from sticking or contaminating your lens, and then your blade follows that suction along the way. So when we start off our intubation attempt, before we are even inserting the blade, you should place the suction catheter in the mouth, clear the oropharynx, and gently advance the catheter to the posterior pharynx to clear any secretions pooling there. This helps prevent us from forgetting suction and ensures a clear path for our blade. Additionally, by pre-positioning suction in the posterior pharynx, this allows us to trap and control the tongue, and we can also use the suction catheter to gently displace the lower jaw forward and open. Both of these things then set us up to have an easier and more efficient blade insertion. Once we have suction, trapped the tongue, and opened the jaw, we can then place the blade at the tip of the tongue and start walking the blade down using suction to clear any secretions. If there's any continued buildup of contaminant, whether that be secretions, emesis, or blood, then once your blade is fully in the vallecula, you can transfer the suction onto the left side in the salad part position to free up the right side of the mouth for bougie and tube insertion. If it turns out to be a fairly dry and clean airway, then you can pull the suction out and bring it back in as needed. To reiterate, though, we should always assume every airway is contaminated in some way. Therefore, it is not okay to not use suction. A common error we see in intubators is holding a bougie or a tube in their right hand when they're starting off an intubation. This immediately sets you up to either forget or not use suction. So for each airway, start out with the laryngoscope in your left hand and place your suction in your right hand. Here's the first video for this tip. I'll let you figure out whether it's the good or the bad one pretty quick here. So here we are, we're at the tip of the tongue, we're walking down, and oh my God, what is going on here? That looks like a ton of secretions that we haven't even attempted to suction out. I don't see any suction in our view. There's no suction leading the blade, and now it is just bubbling back at us. Hey, there's the epiglottis at least, okay? We think we're in the vallecula, but we're actually not in the vallecula. We have not engaged that hyoepiglottic ligament and that trapdoor effect to lift the epiglottis. Doesn't really even matter though, because now we can't even see the glottis at all. The bougie is trying to be inserted into I don't know where, and then essentially the secretions bubble up and contaminate our blade. They were unable to intubate again as this lens was completely contaminated, could not be cleaned. So here's another video with good but not ideal techniques. So let's see how this one goes. So here we are, we recognize nasty airway right off the bat. You can see suction immediately leading the blade as it's inserted, and you see a bunch of secretions pooling there, and the suction continues to clear the blade before the blade is in advance, and then we continue to spot check and clear out a lot of secretions there. We've gotten into a midline 50-50 view. We're definitely not too deep. If we gotten too deep here, I almost assuredly say that we would have gotten contaminated. But with this 50-50 view, we stay high and dry, even with a little bit sloshing there. I would like to have seen a salad technique and have that section plunged into that left corner there. However, we don't do it in this case. But here we're overall 50-50 and midline maybe a little bit right. Bougie passes quite nicely as it goes in. And then we're advancing our bougie, and you're going to see the tube come in a second here. I think we have a little bit of delay on the tube. A little bit of difficulty advancing the bougie. The tube goes in ultimately, and then what you're going to see is secretions immediately come up this tube as soon as that bougie is pulled. This is a great chance for you to use a soft suction immediately before you attach the end tidal and clean that airway out so you don't contaminate your end tidal detector. Now for tip number 5, the last of the day. It's all about bougie and tube manipulation. There's nothing more frustrating for you or for us watching in the OMD your videos than seeing you trip at the goal line because of not troubleshooting the bougie or the tube. So remember, if you're pushing the bougie down and it gets stuck on the anterior tracheal wall, do a rings right maneuver. That means to rotate the bougie to the right, bringing that coude tip off that anterior wall into the middle of the airway and allowing the bougie to pass. This should just be instinctive for you. You should rotate right every time, and then you won't get caught up along the way. If you're passing the tube or railroading it down the bougie and it gets stuck on those right-sided tissue and structures, the arytenoids, then it's an inlet left maneuver. Back up the tube about 1 centimeter. That's critical so you're not spinning the tube on the tissues themselves. So back up and then spin it to the left and move it through the airway then. That should bring you home free at that point. So let's take a look at a video to show all this. So this video is about 2 minutes in duration. I'm going to skip over some of the longer parts and I'll let you know about those along the way. So here we scissor the mouth open. We're walking down the tongue in the midline fashion. Definitely needed some suction there. However, we don't and get lucky about it. There's a hyoepiglottic ligament in the vallecula, which we're going to put our blade into in a second. You're going to see him dab the back of the airway there. That's a way that you can contaminate your blade. So stay high and dry and a little upward tension on your blade as you're walking it down. But this is a 50-50 view overall. We're a little bit off midline. Maybe we could have come a little bit back, but it should be a great view overall that we can pass the Bougie with. So the Bougie passes right past cords, but then gets stuck on those anterior tracheal rings there. And so this is where you immediately do your rings right maneuver. Instead, this intubator keeps the Bougie straight up, doesn't rotate it, and it's just trying to force this Bougie down, and it just keeps on getting stuck. As you watch this, you can just feel their frustration growing as this Bougie will just not pass. And so I'm going to pause right here. So now we're about 50 seconds ahead. The Bougie was basically rammed in, and now we are passing the tube. And now you see that the tube gets caught up on that right arytenoid. And so what we need to do here is retract that tube back about 1 centimeter, rotate it to the left to bring that tip into the midline, and then it'll pass. Instead here, we're just brute forcing it, pushing it right against that arytenoid, and we're just getting stuck, and causing a ton of airway trauma. And finally, that tube passes there. So overall, what should have been a chip shot airway turns into a 2-minute ordeal with a lot of soft tissue trauma for this patient. Wow, that was a ton of information really quick. So let's go over the 5 tips to increase your next intubation's first pass success. So number 1, maintain a 50-50 view every single time you intubate. This is the single greatest contributor to your success or your failure. Number 2, remember to deliberately curve your Bougie prior to intubating. Grab that coude tip, wrap it around your hand, and match your Bougie's curve to your blade's curve. Number 3, always stay midline. Start at the tip of the tongue, walk down the middle of the tongue, find the vallecula, and place your blade directly into that vallecula. And then make sure your glottis is midline in your screen. Number 4, suction before and during your intubation attempt. As I said, it's not okay to not use suction while intubating. Use your suction to clear the path of the blade and lead ahead of the blade. If the airway is grossly contaminated before you even put the blade in, clear all that stuff out and then insert your blade. If there's pooling and splashing of secretions in the back of the throat, clear as much as you can out and then use a salad technique. Number 5, use your Bougie and your tube troubleshooting maneuvers. If the Bougie gets caught, rings right. Turn that Bougie to the right. If your tube gets caught on the inlet in that right arytenoid, inlet left, pull back, spin the tube to the left, and pass it through. So this video moves pretty quickly. So if you need to go back and review any portions again, I highly encourage you to do so. These fundamentals need to be committed to memory and be second nature for us really to ensure that they are done correctly once we are out in the field and placed under stress. As I discussed earlier, if you can follow these 5 tips, you'll set yourself up to be very successful with your intubations. I appreciate everyone's attention. And as always, if you have any questions, you can contact me directly or reach out to anyone in the OMD. Until next time, take care and be safe, everyone.